We are live. Welcome back, everyone, to a live stream of the Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the intersection of economics, geopolitics, conflict, and this time it's pretty heavy all three of those because we are returning to the situation in the Middle East, the war with Iran, but increasingly also now affecting Lebanon, and of course the fallout of this conflict, of this instability on the Strait of Hormuz. We've had many different angles of it, and one video I made a couple of days ago talk about the butterfly effect, the sustained level of inflation, sustained impact that this is going to have, similar to sort of what happened under COVID or the war in Ukraine, where price levels remain higher, and generally sort of we see this new baseline established. That's at least some economists that I've been speaking to. But someone who I respect greatly and has some very blunt takes on things is Pyotr Schiff, and who we've had on the show, 18 months ago, I think, Pyotr. It's good to have you back. You've been on all sorts of different podcasts and shows and such. What are you feeling about this as the markets open on Monday today?
Well, feeling about what? There's a lot of stuff going on.
What do you feel about just the state of where we're going with the global economy right now, as the war continues and Trump seems to be showing there's no sense of strategic clarity, right? He doesn't have any idea what he's doing.
Yeah, I think the initial reaction to what's happening, I think, is wrong. I think that the dollar has gotten a bit of a bid, although not today, but the dollar has strengthened. Gold, which had been making record highs prior to the conflict, when the conflict broke out, gold actually pulled back, and now it's hanging out around 5,000, which I think is the support level. And the stock market, though it's gone down, hasn't gone down very much. We've actually got a rally in Bitcoin. I mean, nothing huge, but it's actually moved up a bit. And I think that shows that people have a lot of complacency about the situation. They do expect it will be resolved, relatively quickly. And I think, that's more wishful thinking than taking a more realistic perspective on how this conflict may actually evolve, especially if you look at history, because we don't have a good history of getting involved in the Middle East and having anything work the way planned. And certainly nothing happens quickly. Things take a lot longer. They cost a lot more. And I think they generally do more harm than good. So while everybody is focusing on, this could be very good that we, get rid of the current regime in Iran, nobody knows what might replace it, because it could easily be something worse. And we could make a lot more enemies in the Gulf. You go in there and start killing a lot of people. A lot of the survivors resent that. They have relatives, they have friends. And so I think it kind of feeds the narrative that America is the big villain, and it makes it a lot easier to recruit, terrorists that are willing to sacrifice themselves, to get back at us. So I think it's going to be a problem, but it also is masking the bigger underlying trends that were going on before this whole war broke out. And that may be one of the reasons that we have the war, as a distraction from other things, because the U.S. economy is extremely weak, despite the fact that Trump has claimed that it's the strongest in history, when it's objectively much weaker than it was under Biden. Not that I was a big fan of Biden, I wasn't, but I can see that, the trends that were in place under Biden have continued under Trump, so that the economy is weaker. The GDP growth in 2025 was lower than the slowest growth of any year that Biden was president, substantially lower than 2024. Inflation is heading up, not down. We're not creating jobs. I think in 2024, the U.S. added about 2.5 million jobs, something like that. I mean, not great jobs, a lot of part-time jobs. But in 2025, it was only about 150,000. I mean, a fraction, about 1/10 of what we got under Biden. And I think about half of them were in healthcare. So, we don't have a strong labor market. We have a weak labor market. We have a weak economy. The only thing strong is inflation. And now it's going to get a lot worse, not because oil prices are rising, which they will, but because we're going to have bigger deficits and more money printing to fund the war and to prop up the economy and to prop up the housing market, which is on the verge of a major collapse. Housing is the most unaffordable it's ever been. Home prices in the U.S. should drop at least 30%, maybe more nationwide. That's going to create a crisis in and of itself because housing is the basis of a lot of debt. And a lot of loans will default when home equity vanishes. I mean, we know that because we've already experienced it. And I think the world was already in the process of de-dollarizing. And I think that what's happened recently has slowed the process down a bit with this knee-jerk move into the dollar. But I think in short order, the trend out of the dollar, out of U.S. treasuries is going to resume. And that's when you're going to see new highs in gold.
Well, I want to come to China a little bit later on, because I think that's something that's obviously on the minds of people from a geoeconomic standpoint. But as I said in my outsell and the intro, the big consideration for many, including Europe, who Trump is badgering to get involved now, is what is the objective here? What are the strategic objectives? And so simply from your perspective, is this about oil? Is this about energy security for the United States? Or is this about actually weapons and IRGC and the regime?
Well, I have no idea. I mean, the one thing I know for sure is whatever Trump is saying is probably not the truth. Trump has a history of lying. And it's not unique to Trump. He just seems to do it more frequently and more openly than other presidents. But presidents lie, politicians lie. I mean, that's how they get elected. They lie their way into office. Whoever's the best liar wins. So it's hard to believe anything that comes out of government. And we certainly have a history of lying about wars. Remember, we had to go into Iraq because of the weapons of mass destruction. Well, we all know that that was a lie. A lot of people could see it was a lie back then, but it's pretty obvious now. So I don't know what the real reason is, but whatever that reason is, they're not telling us. So I'm sure it's not one that the American public would likely support. So they make up something. But, I can see the reluctance of the rest of the world to try to really get involved here in this. I mean, obviously Trump is now saying that Iran has been this huge problem for 50 years. And this should have been done a long time ago. And now he's doing it. Okay, well, then why didn't he mention that, when he ran for office? Why didn't he say, one of the things I'm going to do as president is I'm going to take out Iran. I'm going to have a war against Iran. In fact, he specifically said that if you vote for his opponent, you might get a war in Iran. So if you don't want to have a war with Iran, then vote for me. That was his whole campaign shtick. And now all of a sudden, well, this is something we have to do because they've been so bad for so long. Well, they're not any worse now than they were a year and a half ago, right? I mean, so the whole thing to me seems ridiculous. And it's not, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm Jewish. I'm not anti-Israel. But the war doesn't make any sense to me. And I think it doesn't make any sense to a lot of other people that we're trying to drag into it.
No, well, I have very staunch opinions about that. But, this whole argument is, Peter, that you suffer short-term for long-term gain, that by eradicating the regime or securing the Strait of Hormuz, etc., that guarantees that it can't be held to ransom by the IRGC in the future. What's your take on that? Is that
it was open for business until we started this war. I don't don't know why it was going to be shut down. That was the problem
before. Yeah, but I agree. No, I agree. I think it's everyone arguing that, well, Europe was suffering with energy. So, well, we weren't before this war started. But, do you think, therefore, that this is something that we can, get a hold of? If Europe can secure the shipping lanes, there'll be a reduced level in oil price or something.
I don't have any confidence on what things look like at the other side. You say, okay, we need to get rid of this bad regime. Okay, but what's going to replace it? There's an old saying, the devil, and And I didn't have a big problem with Trump, bombing that nuclear facility if he claimed it was really making a lot of progress and the negotiations broke down. But now I don't even know if I believe that at this point, because he told us that we destroyed their capabilities. We set them back years and years and years. Okay, well then why did we have to do this if they were in a worse position than they were before we took out the facility? But look, I'm a big believer in the concept of short-term pain for long-term gain. I would just like to see that where it really would be useful. Like, how about if we cut government spending? How about if we cut the deficits, if we go after entitlements and Trump say, we have a long-term fiscal problem here. We got to solve it. And so we need to call on the country to have some short-term pain. You're going to have to get less government benefits. That I could get on board with. But he doesn't want any of that kind of pain. No cuts to Social Security, no cuts to Medicare, no cuts to Obamacare, no cuts to military, big increase in government spending. Everybody gets tax cuts. Even though we have massive deficits, we're going to cut taxes. Where's the short-term pain there? It's all like a sugar high. But then somehow when it comes to the Middle East, now we have to pay higher gas prices. That's the pain that we should be willing to suck up, for some, elusive gain that nobody actually knows that we're going to get, because we have no idea if what we're now doing in the Middle East is going to make things better or make things worse.
So would you agree with the sentiment that, if prices are higher, but they have some consistency, at least you can sort of acclimatize to that, versus the erraticism, right? The volatility. If oil is 1 minute 120, then it's 100, then it's 80. That's worse because of what it's doing to the system as a whole, right? Confidence in the markets.
Well, it's hard to say if bouncing around is worse than just going way up. But I think that oil prices are going a lot higher. And the thing is, people have no idea how much higher they may go. And so that obviously does make long-term planning more difficult if you have no clue what energy is going to cost, and also the availability. I mean, there could be shortages, especially if price controls end up being implemented by governments, which is something that they typically tend to do. I mean, right now, they're releasing some strategic petroleum reserves into the market. But, there's a limit to how much, you can release, because eventually you run out. And now you're really in a bind, because when you're out, then what are you going to do? You got nothing. And now you've got to refill the reserves too. So, what's that going to do to the price of oil when everybody has to replenish what they got rid of?
I wanted to ask you on that, because the general consensus is that Europe's in a worse position than America, because America has the ability to at least supply itself, or has its own energy security. But that seems to be not necessarily the case. If this is going to go on for ages, then the US puts itself in quite a precarious position.
Yeah, well, also, we still have the ability to export oil, and a lot of the energy we still use is imported. Even though we're net exporter, we're importing and exporting at the same time. So it's not like we're completely self-sufficient in all this. And we're going to be subject to global oil prices unless, they're going to pass some kind of law making it illegal to export U.S. crude. But that also is going to mean we're not going to be able to import a lot that we currently import now. So no, I don't think that we're immune at all. And probably when it comes to prices, gas prices, we're probably more vulnerable, because if you look at what Europeans pay for gas, the taxes that they pay are much higher on gas than what Americans are paying. So their prices are already a lot higher. So if oil goes up, let's say by $3 or $4 a gallon in Europe, it's not as big an impact as the same dollar increase here in America compared to, what we're used to paying. So, we import so much stuff. We have such a massive trade deficit in goods. All those goods have to be shipped here. And so we have to spend a lot of money on the oil to get them here. And so the cost of all that fuel is embedded in the import prices. And it's not just the cost to bring all the stuff here, it's the cost to send the ships back empty. We got to pay for that gas too. So I think we're very vulnerable. And also food prices too. Look what's happening to fertilizer. And America may be a net exporter of oil, but believe it or not, with all of our farms, we're a net importer of food. I mean, that's pretty sorry that we can't even feed ourselves anymore, but we depend on the world for our food.
So what do you think is the time horizon of this? How long can the Trump administration, Israel, who seem to have their own differences of what they want strategically from this, how long do you think this can go on before it really begins to impact the US economy and felt on US consumers more than it is already?
I don't know like an exact timetable, but I would say that the longer it drags on without a victory, the bigger the problem gets. I mean, obviously, the cost keeps mounting every day. We're spending a lot of money, and people die. I mean, not that many Americans, but more will obviously die. And obviously, we're killing Iranians, and they're not all in the military. We took out a school, right? A lot of these schoolgirls. I saw this propaganda video that was put out by the Iranian government. It seemed pretty powerful. I don't know if you saw that one. But they're able to get a lot of sympathy out of something like that. But I think the longer it drags on, certainly if it goes into the summer, it's going to be a big problem because gas prices are normally higher by then anyway. And they're going to be even higher. And then you're going to get closer to the midterm elections. You're in full blown, campaign season by then, because in the fall we have the elections. And I think that the Republicans were already in trouble. And if they launch this war as kind of a Hail Mary to try to bail them out, if they could get people to rally around the president out of patriotism or something, that could backfire too, because if it's not going as smoothly as planned, it's just going to be another negative that's going to impact the Republicans. And it could be a massive blowout. The Republicans may not just lose the House, which is pretty much a foregone conclusion, but they may lose the Senate as well.
So what about the whole remnants of the tariffs? Trump's not exactly been constructive in his relations with the world and trade. Do you think that the longer that this war goes on, it's going to expose America's susceptibility to some of their own tariffs? I'm thinking India. You talked about fertilizer. India's having to switch to 4-day working weeks because the economy is being so disrupted by what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I think the president risks a lot of damage to the United States on the global stage. I think he's antagonizing a lot of people that we really need to support us. I think he's misplaying his hand. He thinks that we have all the cards in the relationship we have with our trading partners, but I think it's the opposite. The United States is very dependent on the world. We depend on the world for the goods that we don't produce and for the money that we don't save. We import all sorts of goods, $1 trillion a year more than we export. And we borrow from the world to finance those trade deficits and our budget deficits. The only reason America has this big military is because the world loans us the money to pay for it. If we couldn't borrow all this money, we couldn't have this big military. And I think the world is going to start to second guess the wisdom of enabling this if they look at the U.S. as a threat, not as a protector, but as an aggressor, especially when Trump spoke so openly about invading Greenland and taking Greenland by force because he thought it was in our strategic interest to own Greenland. And he didn't care what the Greenlanders thought. It was like, we're just going to take it, right? That, I think, was something that would have set off alarm bells around the world. And, Trump lectures the world about how the world rips us off and takes advantage of us, and you need to pay for the privilege, and maybe we'll pull out of NATO and we're not going to protect you. And I think all of this is okay, what the hell are we doing holding all these dollars and buying all these treasuries if this is how the U.S. is going to act. And I think it's pushing the world away from the dollar, which I think is ultimately the right move for the world. I think there is a huge cost that is exacted on the world to support the United States. Keeping the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency means a massive subsidy to America paid for by the rest of the world, disproportionately by the emerging markets who shoulder, the lion's share of the burden. And I think that to the extent that the world dumps the dollar and stops supplying us with goods and stops loaning us money, I think that creates an economic boom outside the United States, because now they have a lot more stuff to consume themselves, a lot more capital to invest productively in their own economies. And I think that puts the United States in a real predicament, because now we have to run a consumer-based economy with nothing to buy, and we have to fund all this debt without any savings. So we have a complete implosion of our bubble economy. And, Trump is basically egging the world on, right, to pull the rug out from under us.
Yeah, he's taking a sledgehammer, I think, to any remnants. What really frustrates me as of today, I'm releasing a video on it after our conversation, actually, Peter, but is that he criticizes or insults a lot of allies, partners, which, in some ways they should pay more or hold up their end of the bargain, sort of thing. But then he's calling on them to be part of a coalition to, secure the maritime pathways and so on. So it's very much hypocritical. But just a little bit more on this element of what, Trump's antagonistic foreign policy is doing for the US global standing. The GCC and the relationships to them, the petrodollar. China was instrumental a couple of years ago in establishing a bilateral rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, obviously, that's been affected by the war. But what do you think this is all doing to America's standing as the sort of global economic power? How much do you think China can leverage it by bringing the GCC on side more?
Yeah, look, I think you can already see that happening. I mean, you could read the articles about Iran and, they're allowing the tankers to go through if they're Chinese, or if the oil is being traded in yuan, but, not if they're paying for it in US dollars. I think more global leaders, you can certainly look at the comments from coming out of Putin over the years. I mean, he understands the exorbitant privilege that the United States has with the US dollar as the reserve currency. And we also weaponize the dollar because of that. We use it to sanction countries that don't do what we want. And so we've weaponized it in a way that the world wants to disarm us in that sense. And I think that's what's happening. I think we're driving maybe the Arab world further away from the dollar, closer to China, closer to Russia, right? A lot of our enemies are now, have a common enemy, and they're getting closer. We're driving countries there. Even look what South America in our own hemisphere, Canada. We're driving Canada closer to China, and now Trump is getting upset because he doesn't like Canada coming up with these trade deals with China after he's trying to cut them off with the U.S. You better not deal with China. But look what China's doing now in South America, in our hemisphere here. There's all kinds of stuff going on with Brazil and Argentina. So China is leveraging what Trump is doing to expand its influence and expand its power. And all of this is ultimately undermining the dollar. And the dollar was going to go eventually anyway. I mean, just based on our own deficits, our national debt is now almost 39 trillion. It's exploding out of control. The fastest growing expenditure is interest on the debt. Interest on the debt is now the second largest line item. It's bigger than defense. It's only exceeded by Social Security, which is also growing. But the debt service is going to pass Social Security. So we are going to implode on our own anyway. It's just that this speeds up the process a bit, what Trump is doing, which, in the long run is probably a good thing. The sooner we can get this collapse over with, as far as I'm concerned, the better, because it's coming anyway, and the longer it's delayed, the worse it's going to be.
Oh dear. I thought I was rather pessimistic, Peter, but that's concerning to hear. But like, okay, so if this de-dollarization is really happening, though, just on this point, though, for China to position itself as a competitor, it has to have an open capital account. It has to make the renminbi an attractive place, well, rival to the reserve. The alternative is Europe, but for you to do that, you need euro bonds, you need a federalization of Europe, probably. Can you realistically see the dollar being no longer the reserve currency when there isn't really much of an option alternatively? Or you're going to say good old
Well,
gold and Bitcoin and
there is
things?
an alternative. You just said it, gold. I mean, gold is the alternative. In fact, gold is where the world seems to be headed. They're talking about trading either gold directly or trading in a currency, whether it's a digital currency or, bank, some kind of new currency, but ultimately anchored to gold. That gold is going to be what gives value to the currency. So the only question is, do you believe that the issuer, the behind, the token or the currency, that the gold is actually there and that it's committed to maintain the relationship between the currency and gold? But that's all they have to do. I mean, they don't, I don't think another fiat currency is going to replace the dollar. I think the world will be done with fiat. It's not going to be, okay, so the dollar didn't work, we're just going to put the crown on the euro or some, why? So we got to go back to gold. The world has to go back to what worked. And that was gold. And I think that's why gold is $5,000 an ounce. It's not an accident. 2 years ago, it was $2,000 an ounce. So why is it up at 5,000? Because the world is already making that switch. Central banks are moving out of dollars into gold. That is what's replacing the dollar. It's not the euro, it's not the pound, it's not the RMB, it's not the yen, it's gold. And that trend is going to continue because gold works. And gold is neutral. You're not, giving any one nation some power over everybody else. Nobody gets the privilege because nobody can print gold. And gold is not simultaneously someone else's liability. When you own treasuries, you're ultimately beholden to the U.S. government. The U.S. government could decide they're going to put a moratorium. They're not going to pay you your interest. They're going to cancel the treasuries. So it's the U.S. liability. You're beholden. But if you've got gold within your own borders in a vault, that's yours. I mean, unless America is going to, send the troops into your country to physically invade you and break into your vaults and steal your gold, they can't take it. And so I think that's what central banks want. They want their own autonomy, their own independence. They don't want to be beholden to another country.
No, I think that the weaponization of the dollar has been one of the US's, especially under Trump, has been over leveraged, Peter. But can gold really be seen as that play? I mean, Russia's selling off its gold, or was before this war took off, right? Russia was selling off its gold reserves to ensure the continuation of its war in Ukraine.
Well, that's what gold is for. When you need the money, you could sell it. It's liquid. You buy it when times are good, you can buy more gold, and when times are bad, you could use your gold. That's exactly how the reserves are supposed to be used. Right? It's, oh my God, what are we going to do? Thank God they have gold. Right? That's what they're saying. Hey, at least we have this gold. We can use it. They weren't able to use the dollars because we canceled those. We took all their dollars. So that just shows you how important it is to have gold.
But but surely you should. But by getting rid of it all, you're also putting yourself in a predicament.
They're not. They didn't get rid of it all. They got plenty. They used some of it, and now they're net buyers. Look, gold worked for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, as money. And in fact, when we went to Bretton Woods, after the Second World War, the only reason the world accepted the dollar system was because the dollar itself was as good as gold, because it was not only backed by gold, but redeemable on demand into gold. So we didn't go off the gold standard when we went on the dollar standard. We just used the dollar as a proxy for gold. But in 1971, when Nixon said, no more, we're severing that link, we're defaulting on that promise, that's when the dollar became nothing but fiat. And even though the dollar got marked down because it lost about 2/3 of its value against other currencies, gold went from $35 to $800, right? We had, oil went from $3 a barrel to $40 a barrel. Like, we really marked down the dollar. The world stayed on that system despite the fact that the dollar was no longer backed by anything. And that is what allowed, 40 or 50 years of profligacy on the part of the United States. Once we got the world hooked on the dollar, right, we just kept cranking them out. And we used that to massively expand the size of government and dole out all these goodies to American voters for free. But now the world, it has had enough of that. They cannot subsidize American profligacy anymore. And they're not going to, keep loaning us money when we're obviously never going to pay it back. We're just going to inflate or default. And so I think that system is coming to an end. But we go back to the gold system because gold worked. It's the only thing that does work. There's some people that think, well, we're going to use Bitcoin instead of gold, and I think that's laughable.
I don't think that's no, I think that's a statement. But for a second, Peter, I'm going to drag you away from gold, because there's one person who I'm curious if you're familiar with them, but we've had him on the show before, Anis Al-Hajij. And he's made a big emphasis on insurance, and that one of the biggest economic fallouts from all of this is going to be the impact on insurance. And sort of don't look at what prices are doing in one specific currency or in resource or commodity, but look at the insurance costs and risk premiums and that sort of thing. Where do you sit on that? Do you think that there's some truth to that?
Well, of course. I mean, obviously, a lot of commerce, takes place because you can offset the risk. And you have to have an insurer to take the other side of that. And if a lot of claims are coming in, if the insurance companies are losing a lot of money, if they can't provide the insurance at a reasonable cost, either the transaction, the commerce doesn't take place, or it takes place at a significantly higher cost. And all of those costs ultimately are borne by the end consumer of whatever good or service is being delivered by the company that needs the insurance. So, yeah, and I think insurance companies are at risk all around the world, especially, with their bond portfolios too, because I think bond prices are going to keep falling, and, they're big buyers of bonds. But yeah, I mean, that's they're a big, important counterparty in all sorts of aspects of society.
So moving ahead then, you mentioned before we came on air that, the Fed's got some decisions coming out, got some developments there. So what do you expect you could see from that? Well, take me through what you think the specific impacts of this is going to be on the US economy in the short to medium term.
Well, I thought the U.S. economy is already weakening. That's obvious by the data that a lot of people don't want to address. And the war is obviously going to impact on that. I think psychologically, if we don't have a quick victory, it's going to be a problem. Clearly, it's driving up prices for certain goods, energy, food. That's going to be a problem. The cost of funding the war is going to be a problem because it means we have bigger deficits, which means we have to borrow more money. That puts upward pressure on interest rates. That puts upward pressure on inflation. And as interest rates go up, that too puts upward pressure on rates, because higher interest rates means it costs us more to finance the debt. We have to borrow more to pay more. So we're in that, that death spiral. So all of this is bad news. And then, of course, politically, it's, a lot of people voted for Trump because they didn't want war. I mean, that was one of the things that at least I still liked about the president. I didn't like his economic policies. I didn't like the tariffs. I didn't like the big deficit spending of the big, beautiful bill. But at least, he kept the peace until now he started a war. So now I don't like the foreign policy or the domestic policy. And I think there are going to be a lot of voters are going to be upset about that. Now, if home prices really start to fall, I mean, on the one hand, you could say that people who want to buy a house might be happy that the houses they want to buy are cheaper. But if mortgage rates go up, even if the price of the house goes down, they still can't afford it. And even if they can buy the house, they can't afford to heat it or cool it or pay the electric bills or, whatever. But the big problem is going to be the people who already own homes, and now their home is down 25, 30%, and all their home equity is gone. So that's going to be a big issue. And I think the president even knows that. That's why he's come out and stated that he doesn't want home prices to go down. Even though he acknowledges that there's an affordability problem, he doesn't want to solve the affordability problem by actually making houses more affordable. He doesn't want houses to come down in cost so that people can buy them. He wants to keep the prices up so that the people who already own them can pretend they're rich. Well, if they have to stop pretending, that's going to be a problem. But of course, if they keep pretending, that's actually a bigger problem. It's just a longer term problem.
Yeah, and but if I may, Peter, you're a self-prescribed Republican, so I'm going to presume that your preference for the presidency was Trump, not Kamala. And now
well, it was for Trump, and
so how do you feel about this? It must be quite difficult.
I made it clear. I made it clear when I was endorsing Trump that I wasn't enthusiastic about it. It was the lesser of two evils, and it's hard to say if I made the right choice because you don't know what Kamala would have done, right? But I know what she stood for. I know what she talked about, and I thought that was worse than Trump. But the jury is still out. But again, it's a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened had Kamala been a president. Now, had Kamala won and the Republicans kept the House and the Senate, that might have been a better situation. They would have been, pushing back. In fact, a lot of the things that Trump is doing, if Kamala tried to do the exact same things, the Republicans would be against it. So they're only for it because Trump is for it, right? So the Republicans have a lot more backbone when they don't have a Republican president, the congressional Republicans. I mean, look at Trump is going after the best congressman we have in Thomas Massie. He's the most principled Republican in Congress, and Trump wants to get rid of him because he doesn't want the big deficit spending. He wants to cut government spending. He doesn't want fake tax cuts. But that's what Trump and the other Republicans want.
Look, I could say quite simply that I personally, for me, as much as I didn't particularly favor Harris either, I don't think we'd be having a war with Iran right now if she was running the country. I think she would have tried to pursue the diplomacy more effectively. But, Peter, do you not find it difficult that Trump wants to claim to be the peace president? He wants to be the deal, the guy who sorted it, right? And you've identified Massie, and he's quite clearly a non-interventionist. He's an isolationist to an extent. Is that what you would prefer? Because clearly America needs to be in the global economy, though, but it doesn't want to be invading countries.
That's what Trump promised. Trump ran that way. If you go look at all the stuff he was saying, that's what he wanted. That was the whole "Make America First," slogan, was not to meddle in foreign affairs, right? Just just stay out of it. That's what he wanted to do. That's the Trump I liked. I like that. I mean, at least on a foreign policy scale, I like that. And Trump said he was there to end wars, not to start wars, and he got really pissed off because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. And I hope this war is not because of spite, because he actually said that one of the reasons he wanted to invade Greenland was because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. So he figured, okay, I'll show you. So hopefully he's just not starting this war again out of spite because he feels slighted.
Didn't you get that sense of what he was really like in his first term? He just didn't know what he was doing. He didn't have the right people around him. And now his second term, he's actually able to implement the ideas and visions he always had.
Well, I knew, and I warned people based on his first term, because there are a lot of people that thought Trump was going to get elected and cut government spending, get rid of the deficits. We had Doge and Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. And I reminded my people, I said, look, none of this is going to happen. If you think that Trump is going to tackle the deficit, you're wrong. He's a big spender. He's a deficit spender. He's saying the same nonsense he said the first time he ran, and he ran up the deficits. He ran up the budget deficits. The trade deficits hit record highs. He increased government spending. So he's going to do the same thing again. I predicted that. A lot of people thought it would be different this time because he had Elon Musk. And I said, no, this is all a bunch of BS. Musk's not going to do anything. This is all just to get votes. And I was 100% right. I just was like, look, we've got two bad choices. Both people are going to make things worse. Who are we going to select? That was basically, the choice we had. You could vote libertarian, but that wasn't going to do anything. That was just going to, take a vote away from whoever you thought was the lesser of those other two evils. And so I said, look, at least Trump, there's a chance. Maybe he'll do the right thing. I thought with Harris, there was no chance. So it's like, when push comes to shove, maybe. But, so far, Trump is doing almost everything wrong. He hasn't done, at least he doesn't embrace that woke nonsense, that the Democrats were taking us down. I mean, that was completely ridiculous. So at least we have some pushback against that.
So Jill Stein isn't your choice, Peter? Well, but what about, okay, go on.
Yeah, well, she's the green candidate. She's like,
yeah.
She's at least she's at least acknowledges she's a socialist.
Well, then, okay. So in your mind, then, what of the current political sphere is there? We've got the midterms coming out. It's likely that the Democrats are going to win the House back. There's going to be a switcheroo. What, you're a part of the MAGA non-interventionist camp? Because there seems to be a split in the camp now. Are you a traditional? I appreciate you don't maybe want to give an exact definition on air, but like, what do you want to be seeing from this administration economically and politically?
Well, I mean, I'd like to make America great again, but the MAGA agenda is not going to succeed in accomplishing that goal. In fact, I think it's making us less great than we were before. But yeah, I believe in free enterprise, individual liberty, the Constitution, sound money, limited government, all the things that made this country great. That's what I'd like to see us, getting back to. But unfortunately, we're still headed in the wrong direction. Even though we have a Republican, in the White House, we're no closer to those principles. In fact, Trump, I think, as a Republican, is further away from Ronald Reagan than any Republican president we've had since. So he's not very conservative. A lot of his policies, were co-opted from the Democrats. And the Democrats, they actually want to support them, but they have a hard time because it's Trump that's proposing them, and they want to just be against everything Trump wants to do. They have this Trump derangement syndrome, and the Republicans think, it's just people that just hate Trump no matter what. Well, it goes both ways because Trump supporters love him no matter what. He could do no wrong, right? So the Democrats think he could do no right. The Republicans think he could do no wrong. The truth is in the middle there. I mean, he does some things right, but he does a lot of things wrong. But neither side wants to acknowledge, And when I'm talking about some of the things he does wrong, the Democrats would think that those are right, but they don't even want to admit it because he's Trump. So they have to criticize that too. But he's going to have a hard time in the midterms. But the Republicans are going to have a harder time in the general election in 2028. Because if you look at how politics has been playing out and how the pendulum has been swinging recently, each party gets one 4-year term, and then they're out. Trump won in 2016 because he ran against the incumbency. And Hillary Clinton was a continuation of the Obama term. But the voters knew the economy was lousy, even though Obama kept saying how great it was. Trump promised change, and Trump won. 4 years later, Trump was the incumbent. He said everything is great. Biden said, no, it's not. I promised change. And the voters went for Biden. 4 years later, when Kamala is running, the vice president under Biden, the continuation of Biden, and she's saying everything is great. And Trump says, no, the economy is a disaster now. Elect me, I'll fix it. And so they let people elected Trump. So in 2028, the same circumstances. Trump is going to be running on a lousy record, but he's going to be claiming everything is great. The economy is great, and he did a great job. And the Democrats are going to say, I feel your pain. I know how bad things are. If elect me, we'll fix it. Right? So you have the incumbent that lies about how great everything is. Then you have the challenger that tells the truth about how lousy it is, but then lies that they're going to make it better.
And that's the
lie that the voters believe.
Well, so it's all about anti-incumbency. Is it just running on a platform that is anti the incumbency?
Yeah, because things keep getting worse. Every incumbent makes it worse because nobody wants to do what's necessary to make it better, because that does involve some short-term pain.
But hasn't the US economy been growing, consistently at 3-4%?
No.
It's had a resilience compared to the other European economies. It outperforms economists' expectations, regardless of who's in office sometimes.
Well, the expectations are low. The bar is set low. But no.
So in your mind, then, when was the heyday? Where you would prefer someone like a Reagan to be back if we could find someone equivalent?
Reagan was good. He wasn't phenomenal because Reagan didn't go after the spending. He wanted to, but he never could get the support from other Republicans to cut government spending. But other than that, he reformed taxes significantly. And it was, a deregulation, anti-government, government is the problem mentality. And so he had a positive impact on the country. And unfortunately, Bush took it in the wrong direction when he won after Reagan's 8 years. But the biggest failure of the Reagan presidency was the failure to cut back on government spending. But if you want to know the heyday of America, I think it was the 19th century, especially after the Civil War was over. But really between the Civil War and the First World War, that was when we were at our best, right? Slavery.
But isn't that what Trump's trying to do? He's trying to copy Theodore Roosevelt with Monroe Doctrine and...
No, I wasn't a big fan of trust-busting Teddy Roosevelt. He was more of a populist president. I'm more of a Grover Cleveland kind of guy, who is a Democrat, but and Donald Trump speaks fondly about that period, the Gilded Age where America ran on tariffs, but he confuses, logically, the fact that we ran on tariffs. He thinks that America was wealthy because of the tariffs. And no, it was wealthy because government was so small back then that all we needed was some tariffs to pay for it. That's why the country was booming, because we had gold money. We didn't have a central bank, and we didn't have a welfare state. We didn't have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, any of these agriculture programs or, commerce, none of this stuff. The government was tiny. The government was less than 1/10 of its current size relative to the GDP. Back then, it was an afterthought. And in fact, none of the states had income taxes either. So the state taxes were low. So Americans were free. They kept what they earned. They didn't have to hire accountants. They didn't have to hire lawyers. They didn't have to keep track of what they earned and fork over a big chunk of it to the government. People were free. Businesses were free, and so we had a booming economy. We boomed like no other economy the world had ever seen. That's why millions and millions of people from all around the world came to America, because we offered something that no other country had: freedom, upward mobility. That was the American dream. Anybody, no matter how meager your circumstances that you're born into, you could rise to the top. You could go from the mailroom to the boardroom if you just work hard. Didn't matter who you were or who you knew. It was your own ambition, what you're willing to do. And that was the American attitude, the rugged individual, right? And that was the heyday of America. Once we got really rich and we started bringing in the welfare state and growing government, we started on this downward slope. But we probably reached our absolute peak in relative wealth and prosperity in the 50s, the 60s. And then it was downhill. I mean, the 60s really started going downhill. And then more recently, the last 20 years, we started accelerating. And that's why you're starting to see, the incumbents constantly losing, because now we're on a much bigger trajectory where the standard of living is really imploding out from under a lot of other people, despite the fact that we have all this technology now that we didn't have, which is the only thing saving us. I mean, what if we didn't have that? What if we were still operating under 1960s technology today? I mean, there's no way we could even survive.
But aren't you overlooking the population boom, the role of globalization in the late 1890s to early 20th century? Like, that was a whole driver of what allowed America to be as growing as it did.
Yeah, well, there was always a global economy. I mean, from the beginning, from the colonial days, we were always trading with the rest of the world. So that we didn't just start to trade. I mean, how do you think the tariffs? We only collected tariffs because we had all these imports coming in. So there was always a global economy. It just got bigger as the world got bigger. And then, a lot of people that were not really part of the global economy, like, the Chinese, when they were ruled by the communists, they had nothing to trade because they didn't make anything. But when China opened up and became more capitalistic, then all of a sudden, hundreds of millions of people were part of the global economy. They were working, they were producing, they had stuff to trade. But all this should be benefiting the world. It should be benefiting America. The more free trade, the better. Right? The more people are working and producing and trading with each other, the better everybody is.
Go on. No, okay. Well, I guess that leads me into my final question, because we've been having a great debate and exchange of ideas. We started off this conversation about
not so much as the debate. I don't know what you disagreed with me on. Maybe you're just keeping it to yourself.
Well, I don't think that the heyday of America was the 1800s, turn of the 19th to 20th century, Peter. I think that there's a lot of factors that you're unaccounting for.
Heyday in what? I mean, if you're talking about freedom, individual liberty, what it meant to be an American. Look, obviously, I prefer a lot of the creature comforts that didn't exist back then. I mean, people were still using outhouses. They didn't have electricity.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about what it meant to be an American in 1880, 1890. If you look at the stuff that was going on in this country, the rapid escalation of living standards, the movement of people from the farms to the cities to industrialization, and all the stuff that got invented back then that was just new, that was coming on board. And look at how much living standards went up between 1900, let's say, and 1950. I mean, it was night and day, the increase in the standard of living, because most of the things that we take for granted, people had them by 1950. What we have now, cell phones, computers, it's small compared to the massive change that went on as a result of the Industrial Revolution. But I would like to live in a country where you are free, where you're not beholden to the government. The government isn't your master. The government is your servant. I mean, right now, everybody fears the government. Back then, the government feared the people. The people were free. The people had all the power. You owned your labor. You owned the fruits of your production, of your productivity. You weren't, beholden to the government. Today, the government could take whatever they want. It's just like all we have is what our government lets us keep. Today, the U.S. government takes the position that it owns us. It owns our labor. It owns our income. And whatever it lets us keep, we should be grateful. Back then, everybody owned themselves. I mean, there wouldn't have all these taxes. You didn't have all the regulations. The government wasn't telling you what to do, what to eat, what you can eat, what you could do with your body. People were free. You had real economic freedom, individual civil liberties. People were that's what I'm talking about. And on a relative basis, if you looked at how Americans lived versus Europeans, versus Asians, versus anywhere else on the planet, we were so far above the rest of the world in the standard of living of the typical person compared to the relative differences today.
I appreciate that to an extent. I also prefer limited government. I think there are certain goods that a government should provide. I think public goods, be that in energy, education, transport.
Why?
I do think
You think the government? Well, first of all, you think the government does a good job of providing education? I think it does a lousy job.
What if someone can't afford education?
Well, you can say the same thing. What if someone can't afford clothes? I mean, the free market is the best way to produce affordable things, right? If you have the private sector producing stuff, it's cheap. It's the quality is good and the cost is low. When the government provides something, the quality is low and the cost is high. So if you want, inexpensive food, let farmers, let free market capitalism, let provide it. Same thing with clothing, same thing with shelter. The same applies to education. If you have the private sector competing for education dollars, you have parents who want their kids educated, they're going to send their children to a quality school that provides quality education at a lower cost, or a lot of people will homeschool, or families will get together. And you don't need government schools are a disaster. Look at the result. The kids don't learn anything, and it's a massive bureaucratic, swamp of bureaucracy and money that's flushed down a rat hole. And the whole system is there to protect the teachers and the unions and the administrators. No one gives a damn about the kids. And if you look at what the private schools, cost, the cost per pupil is way below. And, to the extent that there are some kids that are really poor and they can't even afford a low cost, high quality education, there's plenty of charities that are going to be around. If the government didn't steal so much money from people, they'd have more money left over to fund charities. And a lot of the schools would give out scholarships to kids who are really in need and who could benefit from the education. I mean, so I put my faith in human beings and in the free market. Once you give a task to the government to do, it's just going to do a lousy job for everything. It's only, there may be a few things that you could say, okay, the army, maybe we should have the government have an army, that it would be inefficient to have, individual armies or something. But the government doesn't even deliver the mail. I mean, the government does a lousy job with the mail. That's people use FedEx or, these others, I mean, look what happened. Why do you think Uber is so successful and Lyft? Because the government run taxi cabs are stink. The government has this monopoly on these cabs, and it's a lousy service. And the minute people have a choice, they exercise it. So the government is just the founding fathers framed the government as a necessary evil, and the whole point was to minimize government so it does as little as possible, because whatever it does, it's going to cost too much and it's not going to be good. So you want to make sure that most of the stuff was done. That's why in the U.S. Constitution, the word education is not in the Constitution. The word school, the word teacher, they don't appear in the Constitution because the framers didn't expect the U.S. government to have anything to do with education.
No, I like it. But look, I didn't come prepared for an in-depth debate with you about macroeconomics and provision of government or not. In principle, I do agree with you to an extent, but I do think that there are certain goods that, look, if private enterprise can undercut and outpace, improve the efficiency of an industry, I'm for it, right? I've just come back from Italy after some conferences. Uber's banned there because of the taxi lobbies, but that means I have to spend $30 on an Uber for a 20-minute journey, which is, considering where I was, obscene price levels. I support the fact that if you have private enterprise, but the problem is you then get situations like we had in London with Uber, where they're not willing to pay their workers, even though they are workers. So this whole debate around subcontractors, but then they don't have any insurance, they don't have any pension, no provision whatsoever, but they're paid minimal by the company. So
but the workers know the deal and they want those jobs anyway. So if Uber was trying to pay their workers some, exploitive type pay package, they wouldn't have any workers. I mean, that's part of free enterprise. If I am an individual, I will sell my labor to the highest bidder. So I get to interview prospective employers and I get to weigh my options and I get to look at the package that I'm offered, which would include wages, the schedule, time off, all the various things that I value for my time. I'm going to sell my time, because that's really what you're selling is I'm going to sell 8 hours a day of my time, of my labor. Who's giving me the best deal? And people should be free to negotiate the best deal that they can without a bureaucrat coming in and second guessing their decision. No, you can't take that job. It's not, the health benefits aren't good enough. Well, I don't care. I don't want them. I want something else that I value more. Let people decide what they want. And if they take a job, anybody who takes a job, it's because that was the best job they could find. So, what's the problem, right? If a company offered me a better job than anybody else, then that company is, they did a good thing. They gave me a better deal than any other competitor, and I took that job. And I'm only going to stay on that job if it's the best deal, because just because you have a job doesn't mean you can't look for another job. So I got a job, but if somebody offers me a better deal, I go to my boss and say, I like this job, but your competitor just offered me 20% more. So you want me to stay, or should I take that job? Right? You got power as a worker.
Yes, you have autonomy, you have agency. I agree with you. Look, I don't want a third party nanny state, right? Being told that I have to do this, or I should be required to do I agree with you, but I also have a concern. The cost of healthcare in America is not great because it's privatized so much.
No. It's expensive because it's socialized so much. That's what you don't understand. The big things that the U.S. government spends money on are healthcare and education. That's why they're so expensive. If the government got out of healthcare, it'd be a lot cheaper. If the free market was allowed to provide healthcare, if we didn't have all this insurance that was being subsidized, like there's a big deal now with the FDA. We didn't have the FDA in the Constitution, and we didn't have it really until about 1900 when we started the FDA. But what the FDA was initially started to do was so that it would remove from the market drugs that were harmful. But the government had to prove that the drug was harmful before they can order it to be removed from the market. But before that, anybody could just bring a drug to market. You didn't have to test it. You didn't have to prove that it worked to the government. You didn't have to prove it was safe. You could just sell whatever you wanted. And because of that, it was very inexpensive. I mean, can you imagine the drugs that we would have available today, the diseases that we would cure, if the government didn't require drug companies to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on these random double-blind phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, do it twice, all this stuff? It costs a fortune. Most drugs don't even make it on the market. And then when the drugs that do, the drug companies have to charge so much money because they have to make back for all the drugs that they never even got to sell because they had to spend so much money and they didn't get approved. So if we didn't have this big government bureaucracy preventing doctors from prescribing drugs that they feel are going to work and preventing people from trying them, and if we didn't have this ridiculous health insurance system where nobody pays for anything, everything's a third-party payer, nobody goes to the doctor and pays. It's the insurance companies that pay for everything. So everything costs a fortune. Even the doctors don't know what things cost. Go to your doctor. If he tells you you need something, ask him, what is it going to cost me? How the hell do I know? Nobody knows. Nobody cares because we have this ridiculous system. If you get sick, you should pay for it. If you break your arm, pay for it. You have a baby, pay for it. These things are not supposed to be covered by insurance. And once upon a time, they weren't covered by insurance. They weren't expensive. People, when I was born, when mothers would go to the hospital for 2 or 3 weeks when they had a baby, and they paid for it themselves. Insurance didn't cover it. Now it's so expensive. You're almost in and out the same day, and it costs a fortune to have a baby. It wasn't expensive before we had all this nonsense, and we had good medical care in this country. So insurance is supposed to be there for catastrophic. I got a tumor. I got cancer, right? Something really bad. That's where the insurance is supposed to kick in, not for everyday expenses. I mean, you have auto insurance in case your car gets totaled. Your auto insurance doesn't pay for your gas, doesn't pay for your oil, for the fluid in your windshield wipers, right? When you go in for a tune-up, you got to pay for that stuff, right? But we've put everything on healthcare because of government and because of our tax system. So the government has destroyed the healthcare system. Why do you think college is so expensive? Because the government loans students all this money, or they guarantee all the student loans. Before the government got involved in student loans, college was cheap. Even the Ivy League tuition wasn't that high. So people could afford to go. And if your parents were not, able to afford to pay for your college, you just got a summer job. That's what my dad did. My dad grew up poor. He didn't borrow any money to go to college. He just worked over the summer as a waiter. That's it. Paid for everything. A lot of his friends worked their way through college because they came from, lower middle class families. But if you came from, the equivalent, if you're back in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, if your parents earned 100, 150,000 a year in today's money, they paid for your college. It was no big deal. It was nothing. But yeah, if your parents were earning the equivalent of 40, 50,000 a year, so you had a summer job, big deal.
Okay, Peter. Well, I can understand where you sit, but I think you put too much faith, unfortunately, in people and their
you put too little. You're putting too little. You're putting too much faith, because all government is people, but they're the worst people. They're the most greedy. They're the most corrupt. That's who works for government. So you're taking.
I don't think the business in the private sector is any better sometimes.
No, but remember, the private sector, it's all about voluntary exchange for mutual benefit. Nobody in the private sector can force me to do anything. They have to convince me to do something. They have to win my business. But once you put somebody in government and you give them power, they have the coercive power of the state. They no longer have to please the public. The public has to do whatever they want. And there's no reward. If I am in the free market and I can find a way to make people's lives better, I get richer. If I can find a way to lower prices and improve quality, I get rich. But if you're in the government, that doesn't, you don't get a raise because, you improve people's lives. In fact, in the government, you make more money if you perpetuate poverty. If you keep people, if you get put in charge of a program, a poverty program, if you eliminated poverty, they would just fire you because they would have no need for you anymore. Oh, there's no more poor people. I guess we don't need you anymore. But if you get put in charge of a poverty program and poverty doubles, oh, whoa, well, now we need to give you a bigger staff. You need more money because now you have a bigger problem to solve. So they just make it worse in government.
Interesting. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, Peter, we'll have you back and I'll be properly prepared for a debate with you about this, because I'm European, so I do see value in certain public services.
I won't hold that against you, just because you're European,
No, well, some people would say, I'm purely English, so actually I'm not part of continental Europe. UK is a weird anomaly there. But where do you see this going then? Just to bring it home for our final question, with everything that you said, what would you like to see happen? How would you advise the Trump administration with its situation in the Middle East and for the, next quarter or something, the US economy?
Yeah, well, if we do debate too, you do have the accent advantage over me. Because if you say something with an English accent, you automatically sound smarter.
Well, mine is an even better refinement of the English accent. It's not like I sound like Cockney or something. I'm as debonair and articulate as you can imagine. But no, I'd be delighted to join you again. But anyway,
well, to answer your question,
let me hear your take on that.
Look, I wish I was able to advise Trump. Trump doesn't think very highly of me. In fact, he actually called me a loser, a jerk, and a Trump hater on Truth Social.
Oh wow!
So
well, you got in his you got noticed by him, which is quite impressive. So
yes, I got noticed because I was speaking critically. If I went on Fox and just started praising him, he would have said, "Oh, he's a great guy. He's fantastic." But look, I wish that I was in a position to advise Trump, because there's a lot I'd like to advise him on. And I think he's squandered an opportunity. He had a mandate to do a lot of things, and it would have been great if he did those things. He talked about, shrinking government and, and getting, abolishing all this spending and balancing the budget and making America great again. Yeah, I'm all for those things. And he ran against, the swamp, against the establishment. Hey, let's do what the political establishment refuses to do. Instead, he's now part of that establishment, and the war is only the latest thing that he's done. So I would advise him to do a complete 180 and say, look, Mr. President, this is what we need to do. You talk about the heyday of America and how great America was in the 1880s and the 1890s. And I agree with you. We were great back then. Let's recreate those conditions now that existed back then. Let's start dismantling the government. Let's get rid of all the agencies and departments and regulations and programs that we didn't have back then. And then we won't have to pay for them. Then we can get rid of the income tax. Then we can get rid of the payroll tax. Let's truly make America great again by making America free again, right? Let's free America from the burden of government, and let's unleash the entrepreneurial spirit of Americans. And then we will have a golden age. Then our best days will be ahead of us. Let's really do it. And yes, there's going to be some short-term sacrifice as this whole phony economy implodes. Stock prices are going to go down. Real estate prices are going to go down. People are going to lose money. Yes, that's going to have to happen. It's going to happen eventually anyway, and it's going to be worse. But let's have it happen now. Let's have a controlled burn instead of a wildfire. And, let's really create the conditions for lasting economic prosperity and use the bully pulpit. Get out there, have it, tell the public why we need to do this. It's not our fault. We're just atoning for the sins of generations that came before you. But let's just tough it up and let's really reinvent and recreate this country and re-embrace. This is the 250-year anniversary of our country, right? It was set. It was July 4th in 1776. So we're going to have 250 years of independent America. We broke away from England over tiny taxes. I mean, can you imagine if King George had an income tax, what we would have done? I mean, we were objecting to a small little tax like on stamps, on tea. It was nothing compared to what we do to ourselves right now. So let's get some of the spirit back of the revolutionaries, and let's have a revolution against our own government. We don't have to revolt against the crown of England across the Atlantic. We have to have a revolution against Washington, D.C., against our own Congress, and Trump could lead that revolution.
Well, if he's not launching,
he doesn't have any stomach for that. That's unfortunately.
Well, Peter, that's quite the inspirational tone by which to end on. No, I mean, I agree. I think there's certain things that we need to change about the US. I lived there for 5.5 years, and it was pretty frustrating. I don't like the overreach of certain things, but yeah, we'll definitely have to do this again. And it's been an absolute pleasure having you back. As I say, 18 months
and
later.
And to your audience, don't forget, listen to my podcast, The Peter Schiff Show.
Yeah, we'll definitely check out Peter's stuff if you resonated with what he said. And I'm going to stay on a little bit and debrief, I think. And but I'll speak to you soon. All right. Thanks,
care.
Peter. Take care, Peter.